Russian military drills that began today in Belarus involve 30,000 troops and are expected to take place over 10 days. Naval drills are also being conducted in the Black Sea. The exercises come as more than 100,000 Russian troops surround Ukraine and as crisis diplomacy continues in Moscow, Berlin, and Brussels. Nick Schifrin starts our coverage with a look at today's movements in Belarus on the Belarus-Ukraine border.
With tanks, artillery, missiles capable of reaching all of Ukraine, and its most advanced jet, Russia's Belarus military exercises are the largest since the Cold War. It's a display of military might near the border with Ukraine and just a few hundred miles from the capital, Kyiv. And past the sailboats off annexed Crimea, Russian ships hold naval drills. Ukraine's foreign ministry today said those ships make Black Sea navigation virtually impossible and are part of Russia's hybrid war. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense ministry prepared in case of a shooting war. Just north of Crimea, soldiers practice securing an enemy-occupied building. Ukraine uses drones from NATO member Turkey that have successfully targeted Russian tanks in previous conflicts. And to a rock soundtrack, show off American Javelin anti-tank missiles that senior U.S. officials say are now deployed to key transit points. But at the same time, diplomacy continues. In Berlin, mid-level officials from Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia met in a format that's focused on the front lines of the 8-year-old conflict in eastern Ukraine. In Moscow, British Foreign Minister Liz Truss visited Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and at first the diplomacy was relatively diplomatic.
Relations can be normalized only through mutually respectful dialogue and equal dialogue, and dialogue based on recognition of each other's legitimate interests, a search for mutually acceptable solutions.
The reality is we cannot ignore the build-up of over 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and the attempts to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity.
But after their meeting in a press conference,
I'm honestly disappointed that what we have is a conversation between a dumb and a deaf person. They say Russia is waiting until the ground freezes like a stone, so its tanks can easily cross into Ukrainian territory. I think the ground was like that today with our British colleagues, from which numerous facts that we produced bounced off.
After that, Lavrov exited stage left, leaving Truss standing alone. There was friendlier choreography in Brussels between British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Johnson said Putin's endgame was still unknown, but British intelligence was grim.
This is probably the most dangerous moment, I would say, in the course of the next few days, in what is the biggest security crisis that Europe has faced for decades.
In response to that crisis, British troops today arrived in Poland and U.S. equipment redeployed to NATO member Romania. Senior officials tell PBS NewsHour they're worried about any Ukraine conflict spreading into NATO, as State Department Counselor Derek Chollet suggested in Bucharest.
Clearly, Romania is facing acute threats from the situation unfolding not too far from here with the Russian escalation.
And to discuss that escalation of Russian troops massing on the Ukraine border, I'm joined by Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow for Russian studies at the CNA, Center for Naval Analyses. Michael Kaufman, welcome back to the NewsHour. We've got a map that shows how Ukraine is really surrounded from the north in Belarus, from the northeast, from the southeast, and from the south in Crimea. What's your assessment of the Russian buildup right now?
Well, the Russian buildup is entering a fairly advanced stage. You've seen troops arrive and actually grab reposition equipment. There's a sizable Russian deployment in Belarus, just north of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. There are a lot of Russian troops both northeast and east of Ukraine, and there's a fairly sizable Russian deployment in Crimea. Plus, there are additional ships along the way, amphibious assault ships that are bringing even more troops to reinforce some of the Russian forces in Crimea. So what you're beginning to see are kind of what look like the final stages of a very sizable military buildup, a military that is positioning itself to be able to conduct a large-scale military operation.
And last time we spoke about a month ago on this show, you pointed out how a lot of the hardware was in place, but the personnel wasn't quite in place yet. Is that personnel now in place?
Yes, that picture is very much has changed. So we've seen personnel arrive, grab their equipment, move much closer to the Ukrainian border towards final staging grounds, begin to conduct exercises that bring the personnel up to higher readiness levels. You've seen a lot of tents deployed in field camps with troops in them, right? A lot of logistics have shown up, the kind of things that you would see a military bring that's not necessarily preparing for an exercise, but more than likely is positioning itself for an operation. Everything from medical, fuel, ammunition, communications, these kind of elements. You've seen aviation shift over, aircraft, helicopters, and you've seen troops come very close to the borders. That equipment that in the past we saw based maybe 200, 300 kilometers away from Ukraine, kind of staging there. They've grabbed that gear and they've gone down to maybe within 30 kilometers of the Ukrainian border at this point.
One other element of the presence that senior officials I talk to are very worried about is electronic warfare, Russia's ability to cut off Ukraine's cell phones, internet, satellites. How large, how real is that threat?
It's very real. You've seen the Russian military bring all sorts of different types of electronic warfare systems, some fairly high level. They're accompanying the various units that have deployed there. And Russians are quite advanced in electronic fire operations, as they call them, information operations. And so you can see a combination of both cyber warfare, which is likely to have some effects, but more importantly, electronic warfare, at both kind of the tactical level, but also fairly high-end systems that might have some strategic effects as well.
We were focused on the exercises today in Belarus. We saw that at the top of the story. And I want to go back to another map to show why people are so concerned about those troops in Belarus, the fear of troops in Belarus coming down toward Kyiv in a pincer move. It's surrounding Kyiv. U.S. officials I talked to are very worried about that. What does that say about Russia's intentions?
Sure. Those scary red arrows that you have on the map are actually a fairly realistic depiction of at least one of the likely Russian courses of action. That is, that they intend to encircle the Ukrainian capital and impose regime change, perhaps install a pro-Russian regime or change the constitution. You're also likely to see a fairly large incursion by Russian troops both south from Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, and also in the east, perhaps enveloping the bulk of Ukraine's forces, which are currently deployed in the southeast along the line of control opposite the Donbass, that is the occupied separatist territory. So you're likely going to see a fairly sizable Russian incursion potentially across the eastern regions of Ukraine, looking to envelop or cut off a large number of the Ukrainian military that's based there.
Now, senior U.S. officials who I talked to are as concerned as they are, given the things that you're describing and the capacities of Russia that are on the border. But they do say that Vladimir Putin has not made a final decision yet. And certainly the U.S., the West, in what they say is a united way, are trying to come up with a Russian off-ramp. But those things that the West are offering Russia are far from what Russia's core demands are. So do you see any possible diplomatic off-ramp in this moment?
I've sadly been pessimistic all along, looking some months out at this, and I've seen the likelihood for diplomacy to succeed as not very good, fairly slim. Now, of course, I agree. We don't know if Vladimir Putin has made a decision. That's very true. Is there a chance for diplomacy to succeed? Well, I think the window for it is unfortunately closing. Right? It's not necessarily that Russia has to conduct a military operation now that they've deployed, but they do appear to be increasingly in a sort of go or no-go posture. So they're likely to make a decision in the coming weeks, not months. And by weeks, I mean only a few weeks. So far, in terms of what we've seen in public diplomacy, I've not witnessed anything that gives me optimism. Now, it is a fair chance that behind the scenes, there's some kind of backdoor diplomacy taking place that none of us know about, and maybe there's some movement there. Russia can always back down. Vladimir Putin can sort of take what he's been given on the table, declare a victory, and pull back from the border. However, I find this a fairly unlikely scenario, and I'm worried that I might be right about my pessimism going into this. If you recall our conversation months ago, a lot of the indicators I suggested that would tell us that they are serious about a military operation and this a renewed invasion of Ukraine, they've all shown up, literally almost every single one of them. So we are now looking at a very different Russian force posture.
Michael Kaufman, we have to leave it there. Michael Kaufman, Center for Naval Analyses, thank you very much.
Thanks, my pleasure.